y'all. I am Jena Dailey from jenalove.com, an online source for holistic living products, services, and education, along with sacred beauty, rituals, and practices to help you blossom and shine. And today I am delighted to have with us as a guest speaker, Dr. Edward Close, PhD and PE. He has been recognized as a polymath, a mathematician, theoretical physicist, cosmologist, hydrogeologist, and environmental engineer, a teacher of mathematics, science, language, and meditation techniques, a practicing mystic for many years. He has received awards and accolades from government agencies, universities, and high IQ societies. I did just receive his full resume last night. And if you would like to elaborate on it, because you're a member of numerous societies, if you'd like to elaborate on any of those.
That's okay. I'd just say that there's a long list of things, and it's, in my resume. And I guess the proof is in the pudding. No matter how many accolades you get, it still depends on the here and now, and what we can do with it. I hope that I will never rest on my laurels. I want to always look forward and be as much in the present, in the here and now, as I can be. So while it's nice to hear all of those things, that's history, and today's the present. So we'll see how it works out.
Okay, well, thank you. And we also will be talking about some of his books, as well as he's got an excellent blog that I've followed now for numerous years, and we'll be able to post those in the comments as well, and to refer back to. So I thought we'd get started by how we met initially. And so going back on my background a little bit, I graduated from Grove City College in 2003. And then I would get married in 2005. I had a baby when I was 26, 27, and 28, respectively, 06, 07, and 09. And then my father passed the following year. So I was blessed to be a stay-at-home mother for many years when my sons were small and little. But I did feel that as a lifelong learner, I wanted to seek continuing education. And I believe the Holy Spirit led me to the Center for Aromatherapy Research and Education online, which was founded by Dr. David Stewart. And that is initially how I got into Young Living essential oils. He's also in my upline for that. But and although I'd been using the essential oils since early 2000s, and I'd heard a little bit about Young Living, but I didn't know fully until finding out through CARE. And I just dove into those courses, and it was such a comprehensive modality. And I then would, the next year, I think in 2013, I went to train under Dr. Christy Bonds-Garrett, who developed the vibrational raindrop technique and just does some amazing, beautiful things as an integrative Western and Eastern medical doctor. But I was I've got two of his books. This is Dr. Stewart's books, some of my favorite. And for me, that was the first time I had seen spirituality and science so beautifully intertwined and combined as kind of I always thought and knew it ought to be. And so impacted by these writings, I knew that I wanted to meet Dr. Stewart in person. So his son, Anthony, told me that in 2016, there would be, I think it was a CARE, or it might have been Young Living's, but there was a conference in St. Louis, which is near where y'all were living. And so at that time, I did get to meet Dr. Stewart in person and his lovely wife, Lee. And I actually did a very short interview with him at that time. But when meeting him in person, he said, and I had him to sign my book, he was like, well, if you like this book, you really ought to know that I reread Transcendental Physics twice before writing that. And so you were right there, we were standing there. So I got to meet you in person, and you had an extra copy of this. And so I think that was signed 4/9/16. you gave me this book, and then I guess connected with you on Facebook, and I appreciated your blogs and just your writing, and then subsequently the discovery of what I feel is one of the most important scientific discoveries of our time, which we're going to get into a little bit, but that's gimmel. And then more recently, I purchased, I've got all these notes, but this, well, actually you sent me this and I was very appreciative. The Secrets of the Sacred Cube, a Cosmic Love Story. But it talks about body, mind, and spirit, the afterlife, and reincarnation. So there's a lot of beautiful subjects and topics to get into today, and we might be subsequently editing this into smaller topic-related segments. But one thing that I was struck in here is you mentioning, I think it was in 2006, it was a Young Living convention, and you met Bob Proctor, and he was, I guess, talking on what is your life purpose, and you very clearly knew what your purpose was, and that was to bring science out of the dark ages of materialism. And that to me is, you know, quite a profound task. But if you could maybe explain to the viewers a little bit the differences between what is materialism, science that's based in that, and then you're also, I think, a member of the advancement for post-materialist science. But what is then post-materialist science? And how do they?
Yes, that's a wonderful introduction, Jenna. I really, really appreciate it. Yes, like you, Dr. Stewart was the one that introduced me to Young Living. And of course, as you know, we had, Dr. Stewart and I met in college. We just happened to be in rooms across the hall from each other in the freshman dormitory. And we became lifelong friends. And he was studying to be a Methodist minister. And that was his life's path at that point in time. I was a physics math major, so you would think we might not have anything in common. But in fact, we found out that we thought so much alike that, in fact, David's younger brother, Ted Stewart, said that Dave and I were twins. We just happened to be born to different mothers. We never looked much alike, but it's interesting because people would actually confuse the two of us. I've had people call me Dr. Stewart, and he's had people call him Dr. Clothes. So it's interesting because, and fits into what you have just said very nicely, because it was the meeting of the two of us in a college setting where we seemed to be at opposite ends of the campus as far as courses were concerned, yet we had so many common interests that we began to work together. And we actually did some experiments while we were in college that you would call psychic experiences or spiritual experiences. We got in trouble a little bit with that a few times, but it's kind of interesting that eventually David and I left school seeking, to put it in very common terms, to find ourselves and to find God. We did this when we were juniors. Both of us were pretty much straight A students, and so it was quite a shock to the dean of the college and also to our parents that we just decided one evening that there was something we could find in life that we weren't getting in the academic setting. So we just decided to leave. And that was a pretty radical thing to do. We hitchhiked. We decided we're going to, well, first of all, we went and camped out in a cave in the Ozarks, actually not far from where I'm sitting right now. And then we embarked on a journey hitchhiking, which I would not recommend to anyone today, but at that time, it was a fairly common thing. So we hitchhiked to California. And this is where we found self-realization fellowship. And both of us became Kriya bonds, which means we were initiated into the yogic practice of Kriya. Now, without getting into too much detail about that, what turned out, of course, many people were skeptical and said, well, you guys are just dropouts. You probably never amount to anything. So we decided we needed to prove them wrong. So we went back and finished our degrees at different times. And David wound up getting a PhD in geophysics. It's really interesting. We parted and went our separate ways and actually lived in different parts of the country at different times. But we both married a very talented women with a lot of talent in music and very intelligent and very similar. And many, many years later, we all got back together, mainly under the auspices of Young Living and meeting Gary Young and spending time with him and so forth. So David's mother, I think, although she never said this directly to me, I think she thought that I derailed his career path, but he actually did become a Methodist minister also. So he fulfilled that and then raised a family here in Missouri. And we got back together then when I moved, my wife and I, Jackie and I, moved back here to take care of my mother because I'm an only child and my dad had passed away. So then that was a whole new chapter of our lives. And Jackie was really my helpmate. And we worked together. We started a company. I worked for the U.S. Geological Survey. I was a charter member of the Systems Analysis Group, implementing, actually, he was Secretary of Defense at that time. Robert McNamara wanted to make the government rational. And so he was wanting to bring together the talent, and I was recruited through the USGS to become a charter member of the first systems analysis group, where we our mission was to computerize, optimize decision making. And we had all sorts of projects from all over the government, like what's the optimum number and location of water quality labs? Well, this is another interesting thing. Both Dave and I worked at different times and in different parts of the country for the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey Water Resources Division. And so our lives went parallel. I was teaching mathematics. He was teaching earth sciences at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And so our lives were very parallel, and then they came back together with Young Living. And so in a very real sense, our lives actually mirrored what I came to see as my mission in life, and that is to bring science and religion, if you want to put it in very broad terms, together, because there's only one reality. We're not given multiple realities that don't interact with each other. Reality is what I would call the ultimate logical system. And we as human beings, we are all modelers. Now, I was a mathematical modeler. That's what I did in the systems analysis group. I built models of environmental systems, weather systems, you name it. We did work for other government agencies. We even did an optimization of the water system for Disney World in Orlando, Florida. When it was being built, we optimized their water recirculation system and everything. So that's the kind of work I was doing. And it occurred to me that we are all modelers. You know, people tend to think, oh, well, modeling, mathematical modeling is something. Mathematics in general has gotten a bad name in popular USA and pretty much worldwide. As a result, you have science taking off on what I will call a materialistic basis. And that's a mistake, because reality is not that simple. I've had people to say, oh my gosh, you have degrees in mathematics and physics. I probably can't even understand a word you'll say. Well, actually, Jackie was a wonderful translator. We did a lot of conferences, both for Young Living and for, there's an organization called, well, it's ASCSI in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is Science and Spirituality, and it involves the Rhine Research Center at Durham, North Carolina, which was established by J.B. Rhine, R-H-I-N-E, who's the father of parapsychology in the U.S. We actually met him and worked with him. One of our experiments that David and I did while we were in college actually was recorded, reported and sent to, it's in the archives of the Rhine Institute in Durham. And I've since spoken at their conferences, things like that. So at one of those conferences, Jackie and I met a lot of very interesting people. Among them was Dr. Gary Schwartz. Gary was at the University of Arizona at Tucson. Well, in 1996, it was the second meeting of a conference called Toward a Science of Consciousness in Tucson at the University of Arizona. And at that conference, I did a presentation based on what I later published in Transcendental Physics, my book that you mentioned. And that was my first major effort to bring science and spirituality together in a mathematical, logical systematic way. And it wasn't the first book I had published. The first book I had published was a book called The Book of Atma, and it actually is, the subtitle is Journey of the Soul. And it actually, this is another aspect of this, but David and I both got very much interested in, back then there was a big to-do nationwide about something called Bridie Murphy, who was a lady living in Chicago who had memories of a past life in Ireland and in hypnotic regression. And this was a big debate among parapsychologists and psychologists and so forth, countrywide, because, and it was kind of interesting because from my point of view, the protagonists, the people who were arguing this, was she really a reincarnation of an Irish lass, you know, from the 1700s, or was all of this, was it a hoax or fraud, or had she somehow absorbed this, and there's a psychological word for this, from working in a library where there were books about that. So the interesting thing to me was that both sides of this argument, neither one were scientific.
Mm-hmm.
They were attacking it from the point of view of belief, not science. Science, just so we're clear about this, when somebody says, as a national figure has not too long ago, you can't argue with the science. Anybody that says that is not a scientist, because that's exactly what you do. That is the scientific method. You are always skeptical. You always ask questions. You always say, well, could that be right? Maybe not. Well, back to David, back to the experiments that David and I did while we were in college. David was more of a believer than I was from the very beginning, because that was his basis was a religious background, and he was going to be a Methodist minister. I said, you know, and we both agree, David actually is as you know, had a very keen scientific mind. But in our experiments, we were actually dealing with psychic energy that presented itself as someone who had passed away and was speaking to us. I took the position that that might or might not be true, that scientifically we could explain it by clairvoyance, by what's now called remote reading. And I've became, through this ASCSI organization, I became involved with people who instituted and started post-materialist science. And that was Dr. Schwartz and but Stefan Schwartz, a different Schwartz, not related. And there were 12 of us that went to, I think it was the second summit of the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences. So I got involved in that, wrote a chapter for their first book that was published in 2019. And so to try to kind of bring this all together, that's been my mission in life. Different than a lot of scientists, I actually had memories of past lives.
Mm.
They came to me in meditation after I had my initiation into Kriya, the practice of Kriya Yoga, and that opened up my consciousness. And then I've worked on the concept that we all live in a bubble of our own consciousness that's made up of our own model of reality. We construct inside our head, inside our brain, inside our mind, a model of reality. And our whole life is about learning to improve our model of reality to where it's more and more congruent or consistent with the reality that actually exists. And we've learned since that physical reality is less than 5% of the total reality of the cosmos or the universe. But science has focused on just the physical aspect of that to the exclusion of the consciousness or spiritual aspect of it, which is more than 95% of reality, as it turns out. So I don't know, that's a long, involved answer to your question, but it's the best I can do as a thumbnail explanation of what I do. I actually had memories of a meeting with my spiritual advisors between lives. One of the things in the autobiography that I'm writing now that I talk about is a memory, how I realized various ways to verify memory, because the memory that's stored in your brain is not all that reliable, because it can be changed by your own attitude, your own desires, wishful thinking, if you want to call it that, influence of philosophies of other people. And I like to encourage people to not just accept whatever is taught to you by your church, by your professor, by your science, by political activists. Just consider all of that as somebody else is trying to explain their model to you. You have to build your own model. And that's what life is all about. And I've lived my life that way. I believe that the minute you stop learning, is the minute you stop living. Learning and living are one and the same thing. And unfortunately, the educational system, public education, private education, higher education, it doesn't matter. Unfortunately, the attitude that you're given is that, oh, you go to school for, when I went to school, it was 8 years of grade school, 4 years of high school, 4 years of college, and then if you wanted to, you could go on and get higher degrees. But once you got that, that was it. Education was over. Then you went in, you concentrated on making a living and supporting your family and all of that. That's wonderful. But the learning never stops. If it does, you stop learning, you start dying. I worked as an actuarial mathematics technician as a programmer in Los Angeles in 1960. In 1960, I was a computer programmer writing programs for the UNIVAC computer, which filled a whole floor, yeah, of a building in downtown LA. And then now we can do as much on our handheld iPhone, or certainly on a PC or a Mac, more in some cases than was done on that. Now, I'm going to take that, if it's okay, to jump into the question of AI.
Okay. Yes.
AI, as we experience it right now, is not what people, we're getting concerned now that AI is going to take over the world and do away with human beings, or we're going to become. Here's the problem: a computer is all a computer does is compute. All it does is calculate. Calculation is a minor part of what the human mind does or is capable of doing. So AI, as it exists now, I'm not saying that there can't be an artificial, man-made something, robot, whatever we're going to call it, android, that could become conscious. But what I'm saying is we're far, far, far from that at this point in time. What the most advanced AI that exists on this planet right now is a computer without a soul. There's no soul there, and there will only be a soul when the primary consciousness of the universe, which I call primary consciousness. A lot of people who read Transcendental Physics translate that into the word God. Well, God, as you probably know, in most religions, in the origins of the Judeo-Christian religion, Hinduism, Buddhism, God is not something you can describe. As as they say in Taoism in China, they say there are three neat Chinese characters. One of them it represents, and it can be translated as the way. The second one is said to be the way, and the third one is not the way. The way said to be the way is not the way. So God is something that you cannot describe. When you replace it with a symbol, a three-letter word or whatever, for instance, Dr. Schwartz has this book called G period O period T period experiments. But God actually in this book stands for God, and in his mind, it is what God is, but it's governing and organizing and design. That which governs, organizes, and designs is what I call primary consciousness. And you can call it God.
Why?
Okay.
Speaking, so
I'll pause because I've given you an awful lot of stuff in a short period of time.
you have. We've covered a lot, and there's a lot of different, I think, ways that we could take with this. But since we're kind of in the religious aspect right now, with God, to me, in my background growing up was in the Protestant faith. We moved often, so we experienced a lot of different denominations, from Baptist to Presbyterians to more of a Reformed, Presbyterian, Reformed, Episcopalian, and Anglican Orthodox. And then in 2012, my ex-husband and I at the time converted to the Catholic faith, and that requires 8 months of classes to do. And by converting to the Catholic faith, I did appreciate more of the acknowledgement of saints and angels that were still with us, and even though my dad has passed, and we'll get more into Jackie's experience, but I feel him, very often. He gives me signs and signals, but that they're still a part of that. And then I had Hildegard von Bingen, who was just canonized as a saint, I think in 2012, but she, I think, drew me into working with, she was working, she was a polymath herself and in the 11th century and working with gemstones and plants and medicines. But I did appreciate all of that aspect. And yet, to me, as I've continued on my journey, there's also, especially in maybe the Judeo-Christian sect, it's just we all defining God as a male, and that doesn't make sense either. Like with a holistic reality, there's not just a masculine version. And then, but we could kind of transpire to Jesus, who, and I consider myself a Christian, but I do also think he was one with Mary Magdalene, but and he, but I like how you kind of, when we had a conversation on the phone a couple of nights ago, and how you explained why Christ came and as an avatar of sorts and into this. And so coming from a Christian perspective, there's a lot of divisiveness, and I know having studied theology in many aspects, I can see that. But I think the more we open ourselves to this cosmic consciousness, we realize it's a much, like you said, I mean, I love that GOD, acronym of governing, organizing, and what was the D? But can you speak to, and I know you say in your book it's somewhat institutionalized religion, because I do want to then segue into reincarnation, that you said in our phone conversation, the lack of belief in the Western civilization, that's kind of one of our biggest detriments without that knowledge. Now, there are, I think you say 1.4 billion believers in other faiths of reincarnation. And then now we know, like through the work of Dr. Stevenson from UVA, who has done numerous experiments. But before we get into even the reincarnation, can you kind of flesh out like when we, or how do you think in the Christian faith that it's very compartmentalized, I guess, and it's to me it's lacking some of that wholeness, and not having if we're always praying to like a father God, which is beautiful, but it's like, well, where is mother God too? I mean, to me. So can you speak to that, please?
Yes. Interestingly, while I've been a member of several organizations, I don't join organizations just so I can say I'm a part of an organization. I think the problem with that, whether it's church or science or whatever, the problem with that is the minute you identify with some philosophy, or then you identified with something that is finite, just like the body is finite. And what is the most prevalent thing about finiteness is change. Everything that's finite changes. So if you look at the history of the Catholic Church, for example, it has changed tremendously. And in many respects, it has very little reflection of what Jesus of Nazareth, Yeshua, HaMashiach, the Messiah, taught. Very little. A lot of the ideas are there, but they have been captured. There's another word that doesn't quite come to mind, but they've been taken by people who can use them to control people. This is the problem with organizations. I came up with something popped in my head. I think it was probably 60 or 70 years ago, that organizations are good and needed in many ways to help people to channel their energies and so forth. But they also have a negative side because we live in a world of dualism. Finiteness involves duality. And so there are many ways in which an organization magnifies the flaws of the individual. We will do things in the name of religion, the state, a university, whatever. We will do things in the name of an organization that we would never do as an individual. So you have to be careful with organizations. But there's a truth, and this is one of my writing projects that I'm working on now, and it seems like I always have about 3 or 4 going on at any given time, is to explain the importance of existence. Existence versus non-existence. There was a polymath, sometimes he's been called the last polymath, named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Leibniz was a physician, a doctor, medical doctor. He was a linguist. He wrote, and of course, most educated people at that time, and we're talking 200-300 years ago now, most educated people at that time wrote in Latin or Greek. And of course, all of the Bible was actually written in either Aramaic, which was the language that Jesus spoke, or Koine Greek. And it had to be translated from clay tablets in some cases. It was translated by a man named Origen, who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, and was in the great library there that was burned, destroyed by the Romans. Here's another thing that we do in organizations. The Holy Roman Empire decided that it needed to destroy anything that didn't agree with it. That's the only way it could control the world. The Catholic Church became part of the Holy Roman Empire. And many people don't know this, but Adolf Hitler, his Third Reich means empire in German. The Third Reich was actually the Third Holy Roman Empire. People don't realize this because Hitler himself became the symbol of pure evil because of the things he did. But in his mind, he was doing all of this for the benefit of mankind. And we have people in the world right now who are doing the same thing. They call themselves globalists. The globalists are the real inheritors of the consciousness of evil of the Roman Empire, including Justinian I in 500 AD, all the way up to Hitler and Marx and Lenin and Putin. All of these people, that's what globalism is about. You can dress it up in different forms, but it's still the same thing. When somebody says to you, you will own nothing and be very happy about it, okay, there's a problem there, because when you drill down into that, and this is a problem with Marxism, for example, it's based on a flawed assumption, and that's the assumption of materialism.
Mhm.
that there is no such thing as God. It's the opiate of the masses.
Mm.
That's where we are in history. We're at the crossroads where we have to realize that religion, true religion, the essence of all of the great religions of the world, that kernel, that central core understanding is that reality is not physical.
Mm.
Physical reality is like the tip of the iceberg.
Mhm.
Reality is spiritual, and any evolution, whether it's physical, mental, AI, whatever, is spiritually driven. And eventually, the primary consciousness, which physicists who have bumped into this have different names for it. They call it the 0-point quantum field, or they call it dark matter and dark energy. All of those are words replacing God. But the minute you try to replace God with a finite symbol of any kind, you fail. And in my autobiography I'm writing, in the first chapter, I introduce 3 mathematical theorems that, taken together, actually prove the existence of what my research partner, Dr. Nepi, and I call gimmel, and that is the non-physical part of physical reality. Physical reality would disappear in a nanosecond without the organizing factor. But that organizing factor is governed by those 3 theorems. Let me make a distinction that most people don't make. A theorem is something that has been proved. In the common mind, even in some scientists, theory and theorem sound so much alike that they think they're the same thing, and they're actually the exact opposite.
Yeah. Well, and you're just
So
on
a
gimmel.
part of
Sorry, on the gimmel, it is, I've one of my notes, it's a valid mathematical theorem with solid LCH data. So it is it's been proven that what you and Dr. Napi have,
yes,
it's not a theory, which again is just is open, right, to, it hasn't.
exactly right. Yeah, what we call TDVP is a theorem, not a theory. And the difference, and this is maybe getting a little too abstract for some people, but mathematics has to be redone. The mathematics that we're using in science is basically a materialistic mathematics, and it treats the concept of infinity as if it were just another idea and not a reality. I've worked hard at showing that this is not the case, that you can actually prove. And you mentioned the Large Hadron Collider data. That is the proof, and the proof is the reason it becomes a proof is that the mathematical system that I put together, that I call the calculus of I turned my cell phone off. The mathematics has to be based on reality. This is why I said existence is such an important thing. If something exists, it's real. If it's only conceptual, it does not exist, then it will lead you to paradoxes and unprovable. And that's what most of string theory is. It's things that are logically consistent within their own system, but cannot be proved. And that's because mathematics lost the connection with reality when they departed from Euclidean geometry and some of the basic ideas that were brought in from the last high age, which is about, we're about 10,000 years from the next point of maximum mental and spiritual virtue in the human race on this planet. So when you take a mathematics and think about this for a minute, all of the things we use to measure are arbitrary. The King of England set up the English measuring system. A foot was the length of his foot. A yard was from his nose to his thumb out here. In my case, that would be about a yard and 6 inches because I happen to have long arms, but that was the basis. An inch was the last digit of the thumb of the king. Okay, the French tried to improve this by saying, well, let's standardize it. Let's make a platinum bar and let's base everything on the centimeter. And the centimeter, then everything is multiples of 10. We actually tried in this country to convert to the metric system in the 1960s and 70s. It failed, but it was, from a mathematician's point of view, it was a good thing because everything could be put in standard SI, they call it standard international units. But those units are arbitrary. Now, what the calculus of distinctions, the calculus of dimensional distinctions does is relate our measuring system to the smallest quantum of the universe, of the finite universe. And that quantum is the mass and volume of the electron. Most people think quarks are smaller than electrons. They're not. The electron, the free electron is the smallest. And when you take it as a unit, and then you build it from that, Max Planck tried to do this when he discovered the quantization of mass and energy. He discovered that mass and energy always occur in finite units of a certain very small, extremely small amount. But he didn't tie it to the smallest amount in physical reality. He tied it to the 5 universal constants, the speed of light and the Coulomb's constant and Boltzmann's constant and 5 constants. That was a mistake because that made it arbitrary again. But with the calculus of distinctions, it's tied to the mass and volume of the electron. How you do that, you just make that mass, whatever it is in SI units or English units, doesn't matter. You make it one. You set it as unity. It's like the king setting this to 1 inch, or his foot to 1 foot. We're setting it to 1 electron mass and volume. That's called a quantum equivalence unit. When you do that, all kinds of paradoxes that exist in particle physics, in science in general, go away. I was able to calculate the mass of a neutron, or I'm sorry, of a neutron. They had calculated the mass of a proton, which is the most stable thing in the universe. But the neutron didn't make sense because it was only a little more mass, and yet it it involved it had a lot more mass, even though the units were only slightly more than the units of the proton. When you use the calculus of distinctions with the quantum equivalence unit of the electron, all of that gets explained, and you can calculate exactly the mass of the neutron and proton. So then we did it for the entire periodic table, all of the elements of the periodic table. And all sorts of beautiful patterns came out that were hidden before that. So that's why Dr. Nepi and I say this is not a theory any longer, because it's been verified, validated with the very exact, meticulous data from the Large Hadron Collider. Now, how does all that relate to organizations like the various churches? That's where it gets very interesting, and we could talk for hours about that. But I maintain that the only difference between the religions of the world, the ones that have endured and the ones that people feel in their heart and soul, that has a correctness to it, is the same thing. The difference are cultural, and they've been subverted by people who want to control other people to mean things that the spiritual masters never intended.
Such as Christ, is Jesus Christ.
Yes.
And how
yes, absolutely.
Teachings were subverted.
He was a special, Jesus was special in that his teachings became the basis of the spirituality of the Western world.
And there's a whole period of missing in the biblical account. And of course, that could have been, which books were chosen to go into. But there are some that believe he traveled to India and maybe became more aware of the yogic principles and had that capacity.
Yeah, he did. He went to southern India during those mysterious years between the age of 12 and 30 something. And the thing is that the whole point of human existence is